around 2 a.m. as the armored battalion belonging to the 17th Armored Brigade, tasked with clearing the town, or rather medium-sized city of Temple, of any and all armed resistance, including reactionary armed civilians, was beginning to wrap up in order to protect the major key invasion route of I-35, which was of paramount importance, the utmost importance to the invasion forces of the external prong of Group Armies 7 through 13, moving rapidly inland after they complete their ongoing battle at Laredo, occurring simultaneously to this battle by this point in time. Other actions were occurring within the post after the main post had been penetrated by the armored fist of the elements of the 16th Tank Division that had rushed deep inside the installation, with other elements of the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, the single Mechanized Infantry Battalion and single Combat Engineer Battalion that were follow-up units of the 4 armored battalions, 4 Mechanized Infantry armored battalions of the 16th Tank Division, along with 4 support and logistical battalions of the 105th Logistical Support Brigade following behind them to provide them with a steady flow of ammunition and fuel and everything they needed to continue the fight, as Fort Hood was a major installation in terms of its size and its population. These forces sliced deep inland, conducting their maneuver similar to what the Americans had done in Baghdad with their Thunder Run, racing past many enemy units along the way, and leaving them for the follow-up units of the Combat Engineer Battalion and Mechanized Infantry Battalion, just recently having had cleared the Gray Army Airfield, the Robert Gray Army Airfield, after the rocket saturation had destroyed many of the buildings on its eastern side, as well as smashing elements of the 1st Cav's Aviation Brigade, which consisted of the 4th of the 227th Aviation Regiment, which was a battalion of the 1st Cav Aviation Brigade that was actually at the Gray Army Airfield, that was totally destroyed in the rocket salvos as well as howitzer strikes from the Chinese PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers of the 112th Combined Arms Brigade, hitting the airfield in conjunction with even Russian artillery fired from their 2S-19-MSTA-S 105 or 152 millimeter self-propelled guns that were fired in support of the attack on the western side of the airfield of the Combat Engineers and Mechanized Infantry Battalion. In the northwest of the post, units were finishing having engaged mixed American rifle companies and mechanized infantry-like formations, mostly from 1st Cav, that were doing interoperability training before moving on deeper in the installation, which at that time other elements had since escaped, such as the 4-9 Cav Squadron, as well as the 91st Brigade Engineering Battalion of the 1st Brigade of 1st Cav, in addition to also mixed infantry forces that were conducting patrol training on foot patrols, in addition to 2-3 ACR, or 2nd Squadron, 3rd ACR, all of which having had escaped as the Russian units were now penetrating the installation within the first hour and 45 minutes leading up until 2 o'clock, before advancing further into the installation. By this point, they had escaped before the noose had completely tightened, with the Red Chinese forces of the 17th Armored Brigade having sent in 3 battalions, 2 armored and 1 close air defense battalion, to attack in the SEAD operation the American Air Defense Forces training with Patriot and SHORAD IM systems, again with interoperability training. But the SEAD operation had been conducted, destroying them, nearly completely closing any escape from the installation by this point. It was only because the Russians couldn't physically reach these units in time that they even had the opportunity to escape, while other units were not as fortunate. As it pertained to the main installation, the mechanized Infantry Battalion and Combat Engineer Battalion of the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade were able to, after having secured the Robert Gray Army Airfield, move to clear the western side of the Fort Hood main post, while these three maneuver units belonging to the 112th Combined Arms Brigade had sliced their way in through the main gate area, with one mechanized infantry battalion being tasked with thoroughly moving to the east, cordoning and searching by moving and blocking off whole areas with its subordinate companies and clearing them with others before moving on and doing the same in a gradual, steady movement, while the other two battalions, the armored and other mechanized infantry, pushed deep into the installation to destroy American artillery forces belonging to the 1st Cav Division, consisting of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 1st Cav's Artillery Brigade. These forces would be smashed in due time before the mechanized infantry would split off and move to the north to act as a possible reinforcement should the Russian forces moving deep into the installation need them. But the Russian forces slicing their way in, were very powerful, as they consisted of multiple battalions from their 16th Tank Division. These two Chinese forces, the Combat Engineer Battalion and other armored battalion of the 112th Combined Arms Brigade, pushed their way into the installation, going straight for the roughly geographic middle of it to engage in an armored battle with American mixed armored forces from 1st Cav. As this was occurring and the eastern side of the installation was being cleared, even with the western side, they were being pummeled by enormous artillery and missile strikes from Chinese and Russian missile forces firing their Iskanders from the Russian 950th Rocket Brigade down in San Antonio area, while that battle was actually going on, as there was a different battle there actually happening with other elements of the 2nd Combined Arms Army, including the 950th Rocket Brigade being in that particular area, still within range to fire upon Fort Hood with their Iskander tactical ballistic missiles. The Chinese missile forces, in the form of the 612th, 613th, and 616th, which the 616th was a Trojan unit that was on a CCP regime large ranch property just to the east of the state capital of Austin, were all firing tactical ballistic missiles and cruise missiles at Fort Hood, among other installations as well. The 612th and 613th in particular in Mexico, having been beefed up by their active battalions that comprise those brigades, being reinforced by reserve battalions of the strategic missile forces who were paired with older systems that were either TEL based in the case of the DF2s and 3s, or they had special scaffolding built for them, like the very long range DF4 intermediate range tactical ballistic missiles armed with a conventional warhead, similar to the scaffolding used in the North Korean ballistic missile program. But this was an ad hoc launching method for these battalions to be able to launch these systems from within Mexico at America. They also were equipped with the DH-10A cruise missiles in enormous quantities, fired by many of these reserve battalions, as well as also the active battalions having the DF-100 hypersonic cruise missile, which had already been used on SEAD operations against the air defense forces on Fort Bliss, and were also being used to a smaller extent on Fort Hood, although there was other missiles being used to a very large extent, such as the enormous quantities of tactical ballistic missiles in the forms of particularly of DF2s, DF3s, DF-15Bs, also DF-11As, and more, and Iskanders from the Russians. Heavy artillery strikes were already hitting at the opening of this particular map, and a lone H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft was flying over these inner training ranges and the motor pool areas and showering them with enormous thousands of pounds worth of munitions. A single heavy strategic bomber like this can lay waste to an enormous part of a medium or large sized city in a straight line. An entire bomber squadron of 8 can completely level a fairly large city in a single pass if flying side by side. This H6K was showering the motor pools and the inner training ranges, where often practice grenade ranges were at, and whether it was the plastic hand grenades with the little pop fuses that were tested out here or trained with out here, or the paint grenades of the 40 millimeter variety fired from the 203 launchers beneath rifle barrels, and they could be fired at targets on this ridge line, as there was a steep elevation leading up to that ridge. If one were to be on Fort Hood on the eastern part of the post, they would see all of these different barracks buildings belonging to 3rd ACR, which had been converted mostly to a striker unit. And this was a gym, and this was newer barracks, and it continued on. This map approximately being 1¼ mile by 1 kilometer in length and height in north to south. These are all tactical ballistic missile strikes with cruise missiles flying in. As 2 o'clock struck, the container-disguised based Club K caliber systems were fired in conjunction with the Chinese container-based YJ-18C systems. Now, these were supersonic, not subsonic, but they were not hypersonic, but they were very fast. And there were 10,000 of these container-based systems hidden throughout the country and timed to fire in different salvos for 2 reasons. One was for psychological effect, to keep missiles flying and keep them unpredictable throughout the course of many hours. And the other practical reason was in order to change targeting data via satellite. As the fluid battlefield changed, some targets would be changed, and therefore that data could be relayed to these container systems to change their targeting information, and thereby have them fire at either new targets or changing targets if certain targets were on the move. As all of this was occurring and all these tactical ballistic missiles showered these maintenance facilities and motor pools filled with vehicles, although some were empty, as other units were out training, such as the 2nd and 3rd squadrons of 3rd ACR, which were about to be engaged in heavy battle. These combos of air power, sheer volume of missiles fired, whether they were tactical ballistic missiles from the Chinese and Russians, or whether they were cruise missiles fired from the container-based systems or from Chinese DH-10A long-range subsonic cruise missiles, which were still an incredible weapon, as they could reach deep inside a vast country the size of America, as far as Oklahoma, as these had an incredible range of over 1,250 miles. And although they were subsonic, their range alone made them an extremely practical weapon, and they could carry a sufficient payload. These striker vehicles in this motor pool were about to get showered with artillery shells and hit by tactical ballistic missiles. At the opening of this map, this is exactly what's going on. These artillery impacts are hitting, as these are artillery markers for detonations, where there's actual detonations occurring. These are for, of course, on all the maps, imminent strikes, as in shells are imminently about to come in from the showing of this map. And these vehicles out here on the range road, as driver training was conducted back here, as well as driving vehicles out to training as the range road went around Fort Hood and led to different training areas, as these tanks here, an armored company from 1st Cav, were driving during a training exercise, but they were about to get showered by heavy thousands of pounds of munitions and wiped out, including these forces up here in these inner training ranges. As this arrow here and here are encapsulated by red, they're completely annihilated. This red on the side indicates they're being hit by the shrapnel and debris from the blasts happening here, but this is flying extremely fast, so within a mere second, all of this is being annihilated by the raw power of the H6K. As well as all the missiles and artillery strikes coming in. The entire maintenance areas and all the facilities having to do with storing vehicles and maintaining them, such as all these motor pools, were completely wiped out and annihilated. As far as it related to the troops, many of the troops were unfortunate and could not reach their weapons on time. And therefore, it was very rare when an actual armorer that didn't live off post that was actually around at this given moment, as the Chinese were coming down block by block, sweeping whole barracks areas for POWs or eliminating those who tried to flee. It was very rare that an armorer got to their armory in the basement on time, opened up the armory room, and began to throw rifles out instead of signing them out. And there was almost no ammunition at this time because all the ammo was stored on the other side of the post, and the only units that had ammo were those that were conducting the real-life simulated training, the real battlefield simulated training out in the training areas. The only people that had any type of weapons with ammo were the MPs, and many of them had been wiped out by this point, leaving these troops that were partying just moments before the invasion when the tandem cyber strike and anti-satellite strike occurred, leaving them confused and dazed, many of them even intoxicated, running towards this parking lot between Hell on Wheels and Old Ironsides, which were one-way streets that led different ways with parking lots between them for POVs or personal vehicles of the troops or those who worked there. They could be used by visitors as well, visiting troops in the barracks or what have you. These were all being hit as these were being showered by missiles of all types, cruise and tactical ballistic, as well as air power from a strategic air raid flying over this whole area, wiping all of them out with artillery coming in, even loitering munitions, Ch1nese flying over and hitting these groups of running armed civilians on AI targeting mode, and the Chinese troops firing and cutting down all these troops that tried to flee, with these being engaged. The red lines by them indicates they hadn't been eliminated, but they were being engaged as they were running. Hitting moving targets sometimes takes a minute, and as they got to this point, they were completely cut down by all the small arms and vehicle fire from the Chinese mechanized infantry troops, as well as being hit by their loitering munitions, their Ch1nese, which assisted in destroying these two LMTVs, as well as eliminating groups of running troops, most of which were unarmed. Those that refused to surrender were simply just cut down. Those that were able to and willing to surrender that did were treated somewhat humanely. As all of this was going on, and the entire installation basically looked like this, as this exact thing was going on all throughout all the motor pools, and even hitting a lot of the barracks buildings themselves, although many were spared for the seeking of POWs, giving them a chance to surrender. The entire installation was a cratered moonscape, as the battles out in the training ranges were really beginning to get underway in earnest, while the main post was completely overrun in a matter of less than 2 hours' time with the showering of missiles and artillery and air raids. There was really nothing left for the troops to do other than to either accept their fate and fall, trying to resist or run, or to surrender. And due to the fact that only 1/4 of the troops are out training in the training ranges, the Chinese and Russian capture of the main post netted them thousands of POWs, as well as eliminating many thousands of others that refused to surrender or got caught up in the motor pools at the time of the artillery and missile and air raids and strikes. This place was simply decimated. And as this was all occurring here, with all of this being destroyed, including even this group of strikers trying to get away and this group of trucks trying to flee, they just left, this platoon of strikers left the motor pool from 3rd ACR. They were getting pounded by artillery, cruise missiles coming in here, as right here, tactical ballistic missiles impacting the whole area, destroying everything. And of course, the heavy H-6K was flying, doing its run over this large area, showering it with thousands upon thousands of pounds of HE munitions, blasting humongous craters and throwing debris everywhere and rubble, and dirt. These prisoners down here where these red arrows are, these are the cordons and sweep operations where the Chi-coms come up and block off an area, sweep the barracks. They go down in the basement where the armory is. They sweep the offices on the first floor, send troops up through all the top floors to the barracks rooms to grab all the POWs. This was a rapid lightning strike against Fort Hood. It was only the saving grace that there were units training in the training areas with live ammo that even made any type of resistance even remotely possible, as all the communications were gone, including due to electronic warfare jamming the redundant radios, and also the portable radars utilized by air defense systems. The installation was in a completely hopeless state. And as all of this was happening, the air assault operation conducted by the Special Operations troops of the Independent Falcon Special Operations Battalion of the 68th PLA Group Army, flown in by the PLAAF 15 helicopters dedicated to just this specific battle, as the 68th PLA Group Army didn't have an aviation regiment or brigade of its own, as some group armies had them while others did not. They utilized the PLAAF's resources in the form of their rotary aircraft to fly a company in at a time, as two of the companies of the Falcon Special Operations Battalion, as it had 6 regular companies of operators. It had a heavy special weapons company, which consisted of 82 millimeter mortar platoons, FPV drone platoon, and also a robotics platoon. But for the sake of this operation, only 2 of these special operations companies within this battalion were to be flown in and supported by local air defense forces of this battalion from the 112th Combined Arms Brigade that split its 6 combat air defense batteries into 3 prongs through Killeen Fort Hood, one all the way towards the main gate in Killeen, which of two batteries, which were company-sized elements, another 2 batteries, and then another near the eastern airfield, which is called the Hood Army Airfield. They were well within range of their FN-6 missiles and even their 25 millimeter autocannons. They had quad 25 autocannons on each vehicle, as each battery had 8 of these SPAAA 95A vehicles, which replaced the QW2 missile with the longer range FN-6. They were now within range to support these troops, as again, there were some helos that were part of the training operations, and some were now returning to the area, not sure of what was going on with all the blasting and fighting going on, and they intended on returning to the airfield to try to figure out what was going on, as their communications were jammed, and they wanted to check on their airfield because that's where their aircraft operated out of, and that's where their maintenance crews were, and they wanted to check on everybody to see what was happening, which would be their downfall, as the first company was now being air assaulted into the airfield to capture it and to establish a LZ. They were under the protection of these air defense batteries, which promptly fired upon the helos as soon as they came within the range of their vehicles' radars, as well as their command vehicles' radars, as each battery had a command vehicle that had a radar set of its own to monitor the airspace. As they came within the area, this is the Hood Army Airfield, was already being heavily pummeled by missiles, destroying huge numbers of helos, as the rest of 1st Cav's entire aviation brigade was operated out of this airfield, whereas one of its battalions, the 4th of the 227th, was already destroyed in the 300 millimeter rocket attacks at the Gray Army Airfield that were supporting the Russian attack and push against the western side of the airfield, as it was a huge airfield. This airfield was where most of the aviation battalion brigade operated out of, and most of them were destroyed on the ground due to all the cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes, and even artillery began to hit the airfield area on this map up here and off the map, as this was a 1.5 mile by 1 mile map, and there was much more to the airfield than just this. This was the post fencing, and they established their LZ right here. There had already been the 5 other helos of the total of 15 PLAAF helos that had already dropped off one platoon of one company earlier, which went around in a flanking maneuver, all 5 squads, over to this area here, while these 2 groups of 5 helos, which was 10, dropped off the other 2 platoons, and there was already another platoon here as well. So there was already, by this point, there were supposed to be 2 full companies air assaulting this area. And by the time this was happening, at the moment this map is shown, there is a full company and 1 platoon from the 2nd company that's supposed to show up in its entirety, a full 2nd company, which was to join these forces and clear the rest of the airfield. And as soon as they were flying in the area, FN-6 missiles from the air defense artillery vehicles, the SPAAA 95s, were fired, and they were still within range, as they had a nearly 4-mile range, so they were well within range of everything on this map, on this airfield. And they swatted down immediately 2 of these Apache longbows. They swatted down 2 UH-60s, these Blackhawks, and another AH-64 longbow here, which was an Apache, and then they hit 2 more Blackhawks off this map that were flying into this area. After having knocked down these helos quickly with their air defense systems, as each system had 4 FN-6 missiles, and there were 8 of those SP-AAAs per battery, which was 2 firing platoons in these air defense, short-range air defense batteries, and they had plenty of missiles to engage all the helos that were airborne at the time, while the rest had been destroyed in all these missile strikes with tactical ballistic missiles coming in, 2 DF-2s and 2 Iskanders, which were going to hit these group of maintenance and office buildings here and here, as well as, besides up here, there was 2 hits here. 1 Chinese hit, 1 Chinese hit, 1 Russian hit, and another Russian hit right here, destroying these areas, leaving enormous craters. And before the missiles even hit, these guys were taking fire from this group right here and this group. They're firing over these roads right here that connected to the tarmac, and they were firing back, returning fire with their light machine guns, also their barrel-fired 35mm grenades from beneath their QBZ-95 or QBZ-03 rifles, as they had their special pick of small arms that they could use, as they were special operators. And they were also equipped with the very simple but very effective Type 69 RPG systems, as China had an enormous stockpile of these and handed them out very liberally to all their troops. Nearly every soldier had one of these. They were all throughout the vehicles of these mechanized infantry platoons, so if they needed to deploy them, they could grab them out of their vehicle and use them. Same went with the Special Forces operators. It was an old-time favorite of theirs, and some of them were also equipped with more heavy anti-tank weapons, such as the shoulder or tripod-mounted HJ-08 anti-tank missile system. Also, they were supported by loitering munitions that were fired by their headquarters company within their battalion, who actually had a dedicated drone section that had a 48-tube TEL system for firing the 48 at a time of these CH-901A loitering munitions, and they fired a salvo of them, and many of these had already hit helos that were on these tarmacs, but there were others hitting these MRAPs of these MPs that were patrolling the area, and the MPs tried to put up a fight, but they were quickly put down. There was only ever 1 wounded special operator during this entire operation to seize and sweep the airfield. And as they tactically moved, 2 squads from this platoon moved off the map to begin clearance of this area adjacent to the fence, as well as these 2 following behind, as they all fanned out to begin clearing areas. As there was a full platoon here and 2 squads supporting them, moving into place to hold their positions here, while this full platoon moved ahead after engaging and destroying their enemies. After these missiles hit, they were a safe enough distance away, and then they began to move to sweep the area, as they're no longer being engaged, as there's no more green around these arrows. They tactically bounded and covered, of course, as this guy bounded here, then this guy that was here bounded here, and this guy bounded here, and this guy bounded here, and then they formed a line right here and here, while these 4 squads here went around this way. And these 3 squads were moving this way. It wasn't a full platoon, but 3 squads were moving to support this platoon that was already bounding and covering in position. And they had been taking fire from MPs over here, but a loitering munition was sent in to take care of them, in addition to all the ground fire that they began to lay down on these forces, as seen here. All these MPs are surrounded in red, as in they've been KIA'd at the moment this map section is shown. This map section, again, is only a very small segment of the much larger battle. This only shows the LZ that was established during the air assault operation, which was supported by air defense, which immediately took down these helos to protect the LZ in support of these special operators, who then laid down a lot of fire on these MPs and wiped them out, as they outflanked them by moving through this area and engaging them with support from CH-901A loitering munitions that destroyed these MRAPs immediately, and they were equipped with the HE warheads, which were enough to destroy MRAPs as they hit them on their roofs, as well as eliminating fairly large groupings of troops. They could have opted for the fragmentation warhead, which would have done even more damage to dismounted infantry as it threw shrapnel all over the place. Or they could have used the heat warhead, the HEAT warhead, or high explosive anti-tank, but those were best used against tanks or against IFVs, or very heavy armored targets. And the MRAP could be destroyed by a roof hit from the HE round. The HE was like the best of both. It could work well against lighter armored vehicles and light-skinned vehicles, and also against troops, whereas the fragmentation worked excellent against troops and also some soft-skinned vehicles, but it was not as well as not as effective on any type of vehicles with armor like MRAPs, which are lighter armored vehicles or up-armored Humvees or vehicles like that. But the HE round was like the best of both worlds. It was a little bit of both. And that was the optimum round that was picked by the Special Forces headquarters company that was supporting their troops with their drone section, as they did not fly in their FPV drone operators, as they were only moving in 2 companies, as they only had limited helicopters committed to this battle from the PLAAF, as, again, the 68th PLA Group Army did not have its own aviation assets, so it had to rely on the PLAAF for assistance in this regard. So the PLAAF had earmarked specifically for this one battle these 15 helos, and they were sufficient because they ended up taxiing in the entire 2 companies, which ended up sweeping the entire airfield of enemy forces, as the only resistance really came from the local patrolling MPs from the 89th MP Brigade, but they were completely wiped out, as most of them were only armed with pistols and very few armed with their M4 carbines, as they were armed, while a lot of support units were still armed with the M16A4s. But the main combat units and MPs utilized M4 carbines. This battle was over extremely quick, with the downing of these utility and attack helos belonging to the 1st Cav, and most of the rest being destroyed on the ground by the complete and total saturation of tactical, ballistic, and cruise missile strikes all throughout this area, leaving all the parked helos completely in tatters. There was really nothing left but scrap metal thrown here and there, and rubbled buildings where artillery strikes had already come in, and more artillery hitting up here, damaging and wrecking these buildings, turning them to rubble. These buildings were about to become craters from these tactical, ballistic, and also cruise missile strikes from incoming YJ-18Cs and Club K systems. It was a savagely destructive battle. And even as this was occurring, so much fighting was going on in the outer training ranges. Very soon, entire armored battles would begin, as both Chinese PLA armored forces and Russian armored forces would encounter their American counterparts, but would hit them hard with a combined arms strategy like none other, utilizing loitering munitions, combat drones like the Wing Loong 2 firing air-to-ground missiles, of course their complete and total ISR dominance, as every squad in the PLA had a recon drone, a small quadcopter recon drone, which linked into the ISR network's AI system, which was part of the battlefield data processing system, which made the Chinese forces fight as the most efficient fighting force ever known, as well as the Russians with them. And they were now conquering America with ease, as their armor simply smashed over everything in its way, along with their mechanized infantry, very potent anti-tank forces in their different battalions and brigades, even some divisions, as PLA group armies that were reserve group armies still had divisions as they were configured in the old way, where they still utilized these larger units in some occasions. But now the active PLA units were reconfigured into combined arms brigades, whereas the reserves were the first reorganization phase, where they had divisions and things like that, larger type of units. As Chinese war production was extremely immense, China had everything they needed, and they had the highest technology in terms of missiles and AI and drones. They had a full drone doctrine. They even had the first underwater deep-sea kamikaze drone called the Ch1nese, which could sink American subs or surface ships with ease. China also had the most advanced aircraft in the world and more. They had put a lot of money into their military and transformed it in the span of 30 years into the mightiest fighting force on the face of the earth, due to real facts and figures, not just nominal declarations, as anybody can call anything whatever they want, but if there's nothing to back it up, then it's not true. The Chinese have everything to back it up. And it is a fact that they are the world's most powerful nation, and Russia is the second. And they combined finally went after their old enemy and smashed them with their brand new war doctrines, as they had prepared for this day for many years, infiltrating America, subverting it, buying properties all throughout America to become forward operating bases, combat outposts, and jump-off points, such as farms that became supply depots for CCP forces and their allies, barns stored with vehicle parts, rockets, artillery shells, fuel, MREs, water, everything an army runs on. They had it, and in humongous quantities on these properties. They had had over 2 decades to build up their forces throughout the land, as China owned many of America's major ports and had ample time to bring in their Trojan shock forces in the form of their designated PLA units for this task, or their paramilitary units like their viciously brutal PAP shock forces, who viewed this as a war of extermination. They had their own warrior ethos and their own warrior culture separate from the PLA. They were a paramilitary force that was armed like a military force, similar to the Waffen-SS of World War II fame. And they viewed America as a nation that needed to be annihilated, exterminated, enslaved, wiped off the earth. PAP was the CCP elite. They were the most fanatical Praetorian Guard of the CCP, and they intended to make their presence felt throughout the land as they committed the most atrocities, whereas the PLA was far more humane, and although they bent the Geneva Conventions, they never outright broke it. Places where the PAP were designated as far as their AOs were often places where pure horror took place when compared to places staffed by the PLA, as in their AOs, their areas of operation, where at least they didn't abuse their prisoners who willingly put down their arms. Fighting at Fort Hood was some of the most intense fighting in the entire invasion, as Trojan shock forces were indeed what the name implied, shock forces. They shocked the Americans to the core, who were arrogant and never believed that this could happen. But this is real life. These are real weapons. These are real units pitted against each other in a so-called hypothetical scenario, until it's not. As America had been overrun for years, but that was merely the setup phase. 5 million PLA or PAP or national militia, all Chinese so-called students, many of them having to serve in the PLA to even get an exit visa, or one of the paramilitary branches, as China had a 20 million strong paramilitary, all combat grade and trained. Many of them armed to the teeth as well, like the PAP. The Russians, for their part, were also very powerful, not a nation to be toyed with. And they showed this as their professionalism and raw combat experience, along with the combat experience of the Chinese from the Syrian civil conflict, was put to great use as they tested out their new doctrines of fourth-generation warfare on the biggest target of them all, their arch nemesis. As the installation was now in its last phases of being overrun, the final 2 hours of the hardest parts of the fighting were about to ensue, as the main post was by this point under total Chinese and Russian occupation, with, again, thousands of POWs netted, along with many thousands more who were annihilated in the carpet munitioning from the H-6K Heavy Strategic Bomber Squadron's aircraft, or from airstrikes from some of the J-11 fighters and their partners, or their FH-97A fighter drones that were armed with ground munitions to test them out in combat in this manner, as they were originally intended to be paired with the J-20 stealth aircraft, but this stealthy drone was able to be paired with other PLAAF fighter aircraft such as the J-11, the JF-17, or the J-16, and was being tested throughout the nation, Fort Hood being one of its tests. And it performed very well, despite having lost one in a sort of freak occurrence earlier in the battle. The WZ-7s, high-altitude recon drones, the WZ-8 stealth high-altitude recon drone, the two Wing Loon 2 ground attack drones, were monitoring the battle space constantly and knew everything about where the Americans were at every given moment, and thus could direct precision artillery, including rocket artillery, strikes on them anytime they appeared, as they did have hiding places, as there were scrub brush forests within which they could hide, where there were also coniferous foliage and plants that could shield them from IR, as this was nighttime, and these drones had outstanding optics and night vision in IR, but there were ways to deceive them in nature, and some of these American troops were very good at it, which is why it would end up taking more hours after the major fighting died down to begin to net and capture or eliminate the rest of the small pockets that would stay on the installation, similar to what occurred at Fort Sill and Fort Bliss, only this would last even longer, as this was a vastly bigger installation. More will continue in the Battle of Fort Hood. In this invasion series of the South Central Invasion Sector of America, involving just 1,688,000 invaders between both the external and the Trojan components, with all their high technology and means of waging war driving deep into the country, smashing all in their wake, with other parts of the country experiencing their own aspects of the invasion, with California being another large prong, with a medium-sized prong of externals moving up through Arizona to get deep inland. But the Trojans were everywhere. There were 5 million Trojan shock troops spread throughout the country within their different units of their different nations involved, predominantly China for obvious reasons, but also Russia contributed a fairly large contingent of troops to the invasion, the second biggest contributor, followed by Pakistan, North Korea, Iran, and many other Tier 2 medium-sized powers that had fairly sizable militaries that could contribute expeditionary forces to the invasion of the United States. The battle will continue of Fort Hood next.